Welcome back. Let's talk a little bit about the lower leg. So, lower leg. We're going to collapse a couple of bones together, though. There are some important attributes that we're going to connect for our tib. And let's just walk through and identify some of these bones. So, lower leg, I've got the tibia. I've got the fibula. Down here, I've got the talus. And these are the bones that we're going to concentrate on right now. Let's take a look at the top part of this bone. Let's see if I can get it oriented a little bit better. Hard to do. All right. This makes this this is the hallucis, or the big toe. So that tells us that this is our medial side, which would make this over here our lateral side. If you'll remember, if I flip this back up, so if you'll remember, when we were looking at our femur came down and it had two condyles. If we're looking at an anterior view, if we were looking at a posterior view, we had a space that existed in between the medial and the lateral condyles. And so these condyles sit right on top of these plateaus. And so this one would be our medial tibial plateau, and this would be my lateral tibial plateau. And in the middle of both of those plateaus, we've got all this. This is all bony area. This is non-articular surface. The medial plateau and the lateral plateau, that's articular surface. And remember, articular surfaces are lined with hyaline cartilage. Again, just like with the femur, we see some shapes that are taking place here that are just of interest. It's not nearly as bowed or bent as much as the femur, but it does have an anterior bow to it. Another thing that we recognize as we take a look at the lower leg is I've got two bones involved in the lower leg, just like my forearm, except for something to kind of point out right at the middle. If I sit there and I said, how many bones are there in the knee? Most often we would want to say 3, because I would have my femur, and then my tibia. And a lot of times people will throw in the fibula there. But notice something. If I drew on the femur here, there would be a gap. So the fibula does not articulate. Remember, articulate means to touch with the femur. And if they don't touch, not a part of the joint. Now, it does offer up an opportunity for a ligament to attach, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the knee. But basically, there is a ligament that attaches, that runs from the femur down to the fibula. It's the lateral collateral ligament. But generally speaking, the fibula is not part of the knee. Now, we see this huge outcropping of bone right here. That's my tibial tuberosity. Now, my tibial tuberosity, that's where my patella tendon inserts. My patellar tendon connects to the patella, and my patella connects to my quad muscles. So how many quads are there? Well, quad means 4, so there are 4 quad muscles that come down and connect into the patella. Now let's look at the distal aspect, because we have a little bit of a different relationship that exists here. Think with me, if you will, about a structure we commonly see, but we often take for granted. Buildings like the old kinesiology building, which used to be called the Hyper building. It's on the other side of campus. Perhaps you've been in there and perhaps you've seen it. Buildings built prior to 1955 had structural integrity built within the bricks of the wall. And one thing that we see in the way bricks were put down is you'd have a brick, whole line of bricks coming all the way across. And then they would be staggered, splitting the distance. And this is a fairly common pattern that we see in almost all brick buildings. But in buildings prior to 1960, the role of a wall was to support the roof. And so the forces of the roof went down through the walls. Today, you've got things like steel structures, and then a brick is just a facade just to make it look pretty. But if I were force traveling down this brick wall, if these bricks were all stacked perfectly, just side by side, right on top of each other, they didn't lap over each other at all, then I would run the risk of, when a force came down, this column of bricks moving down lower. The force wouldn't be distributed through the entire wall equally. But if I put a force directly on this brick here, then that is now split up equally 50-50 into this brick and this brick. This brick then splits that 50-50 to this brick and this brick, and so on all the way down the chain. And so what you do is you distribute the force over a greater surface area. And in that, we get stability. Now, why are we talking about bricks? The ankle is a very stable joint. At least it needs to be very stable. And if I'm looking at this, what I don't want to happen with the ankle is I don't want the foot moving that way, and I don't want it sliding that way. I want to keep it locked into place. And so to prevent it from sliding this way and that way, which would be in the frontal plane, I have what is called a mortise joint. Now, if we flip that joint up on its side, like this, it begins to remind us of our brick pattern. Meaning that as force travels down, it has to be split. It has to be diverted. Therefore, there's not a lot of shearing that can take place. And that's what I have right here. This is a mortise joint, which means it's really stable. The name of this joint, we call it the ankle joint, is called the talocrural joint. Cruel. Cruel is another word for crux. Crux is another word for cross. These cross over each other. This is the talus, and this is where it crosses, the talocrux joint, or the talocrural joint. More on that when we get to the ankle. But what I want you to see is that the modes of stability of the ankle are mainly derived from bone. Modes of stability for the knee joint derive from soft tissue. We have a relatively flat surface up here. Flat surface, and if I remember what the femur looks like, it is a rounded surface, which means it can roll off that way, it can roll off that way, it can spin, and it can also shear. Sliding that way, coming towards us, or going away. So I have to constrain that and rope it down with soft tissue. Now, one of the last things I want to kind of chat about in this idea of the lower leg is let's take a look at it. There's not a lot of space for soft tissue to exist. If we drew skin on, just like we did for the knee when we were walking through it, skin's pretty close to this bony surface. In fact, on the medial aspect right here, you can even knock on your leg and you can see it goes skin directly to bone. Really easy for things to get compressed. One of the key things here, and one of the reasons why we actually need the fibula, is because all the muscles of the foot and the ankle will start either on the fibula or on the tibia. All of the blood that services the lower leg has to travel through an arterial system that travels down in this gap. Nerves coming from the brain have to travel down through this gap. And so when we look at the relationship between the tibia and the fibula, we see that the tibia, with the fibula next to it, provides us with some pathways. We wrap that in skin. It provides us with some pathways for all this material to travel. And it keeps it protected from having to travel on the outsides where it can be harmed. So it stays kind of in the middle. So as we explore this a bit further, and we'll talk about in our lecture, we'll talk about specific muscles that exist in this area, specific nerves that exist in this area, and arteries that exist in this area, and why it's important to understand where these exist, because these are compartmentalized. They're grouped together. Some are in positions where they can get crushed really easily against the big old hard tibia, and some are fairly protected, like the gastrocnemius and the soleus, which form the posterior and the deep posterior compartments. So the last lecture that we'll do as far as an overview is extend beyond just the tibia and the fibula and look down to the foot. And that will be our next video.